Hello, starfarers, and welcome back to the Tetra Galaxy Telecast. For this transmission's topic, I'll be providing you, dear listeners, with nothing but the spiciest of takes regarding the Metroid franchise. I'm talking absolutely Norfair hot takes, all but guaranteed to make your blood boil, spanning across each and every game in the franchise. I'll spare you the "this is only my opinion" spiel, since you should know by now that everything I say is 100% facts. Though of course, if you want to keep being wrong after I enlighten you to the perfect hot takes I'm about to drop, you're more than welcome to do so. But without further delay, let's begin. The original Metroid. Such a charming classic, and such a dated one too. You don't need me to tell you that though, seeing as a remake was released to update the game for modern audiences to enjoy in 2004. With so much of the game being made ancillary by its remake, this game rightfully receives a lot of flack, but that doesn't mean it's worthless trash. There is a reason that this game spawned a legendary franchise in its image, and I believe that reason is simply good game design. That's right, my first hot take for this telecast is that Nestroid, design-wise, is actually a great game. As long as you're in Brightstar. Yeah, I'm not gonna pretend that North or the boss hideouts are any good. They're obtusely designed, making the objective unclear, the replicated rooms make navigation a nightmare, and the lack of visual cues lead to even further frustration. But Brightstar is different. Right away, it establishes the aspect of exploration the series has become known for by forcing the player to go left, which was very far from commonplace in its age, but it also doesn't stop them from going a few rooms right first, giving them the breathing room to go at their own pace without letting them get too lost. Once the player has the morph ball, they'll pass by some suspicious looking blocks, but they have no way of destroying them. They can't shoot downwards, and they can't hit it while they're in morph ball form, burning the visual cue within their mind that they'll have to come back later. The long beam is another example of Brightstar's shockingly superb design, as the red door quietly communicates you'll have to collect other weapons to progress in the game, and later, when the player collects the missiles and likely goes back for the long beam, it teaches the player that they'll have to backtrack to progress through the game. It's even an optional upgrade, giving the player the chance to learn that they don't need to collect every item should they choose not to collect it after grabbing the missiles. Speaking of the missiles, the player can attempt to go to Norfair right after they get them, but they'll quickly realize that Norfair is too tough to handle, reinforcing the idea that you'll have to go back for items to progress further in the game. Exploring deeper into the opening area gives the player bombs in the ice beam, which explain themselves, and both just add to the richness of the sector. The bombs, once the player uses them, will immediately be recognized as the key to destroying the crumbled blocks back in the earlier room that the player took note of, setting up the idea of remembering visual cues and coming back to them once you have the upgrade you need to overcome the obstacle. The ice beam is also geniusly placed in Brightstar, albeit in an unconventional way, and that's setting up the non-linear nature of the game, and adding replayability as well. This of course refers to the sequence break the player can do to obtain the Varia suit early. By freezing this enemy at about the right time, you can go up and obtain the Varia suit without having to get the high jump boots. It sets up the series staple of figuring out ways to get items out of order, and it also rewards the player for their ingenuity. Even if they don't get the upgraded suit now, however, they can still grab it after obtaining the high jump boots, driving in the idea of backtracking once again. The area ends by looping the player around to the beginning, so not only does the player not have to go all the way back through the area they just explored, but they can also easily grab the long beam if they skipped it before, and want to grab it before heading down to Kraid's lair. Lastly, when the player grabs the long beam, be it right away or upon returning, they can head to the guard room before Turian and see the statues of Ridley and Kraid, setting up the objective of the game. Beat these two bosses, and gain access to the final area. If they don't understand what to do at this point, they can return quite quickly upon defeating Kraid, and if they choose to do so, his statue will flash, and can be shot to be placed in its proper position, showing you'll have to do the same to Ridley. Overall, Brinestar is an excellent area in terms of level design, and an exemplary showcase of everything great about Metroid's world design. Many easy criticisms can be made regarding the original Metroid. I have more than a few myself, but if you're gonna complain about the level design about the world, complain about the areas that are actually poorly designed, like Norfair, or the hideouts, because I think it's about time that the original Brinestar got its flowers for being one of the few parts of this game that has stood the test of time. Metroid 2 is a game that's generally lumped in with the first game, as being an outdated but charming early attempt at what Metroid would become. However, I think this categorization does Return of Samus a disservice, and so my hot take for Metroid 2 is that it's better than the original game, and by a significant margin. First of all, I think most would agree that the storytelling here is much better than in Nestroid. The way SR3D8's native creatures slowly dwindle in number, dying off to the point that next to none are present as the Metroids become stronger, illustrates the Metroid threat and impact flawlessly. And who could forget that poignant ending when you walk quietly back to your ship with the baby Metroid, making you ponder if your actions in the game were justified, or whether wiping out the Metroids was a horrible mistake. I also much prefer the gameplay in Metroid 2. It is more linear, which I don't like, but it controls so much better, as in the physics don't make my hairline recede, and the quality of life improvements, like being able to aim downwards, help massively to make the game less frustrating. There are also more visual cues to help you on your journey, due to the lack of color. The enemies are more engaging, the game derives its difficulty from the bosses and puzzle solving rather than throwing 500 bugs in your face. And lastly, I can't understate this enough, you respawn from your save point with the energy you had when you saved, instead of respawning at 30 energy, making the game much easier without removing any of the actual challenge. All of these improvements, in my mind, make Metroid 2 a significant improvement over the first game. The only advantages I would give to Metroid 1 are having actual color, having a much larger and less cramped screen size, being non-linear, which, isn't necessarily better, but for Metroid it pretty much always is. Having an actual controller, but even then, that's not a problem with Virtual Console. I mean, you could play both of them with the same controller on the Switch. And no area in Metroid 2 matches the level design of Brinestar, which of course I talked about a minute ago. Metroid 1 might have its advantages, but Metroid 2's improvements handily placed it above the original in terms of quality. And if I had to pick one of these games to play right now, you bet your bounty credits I'm going with Metroid 2. If you caught my inaugural telecast, then you would know that this is my favorite game of all time. That being the case, of course, I of all reporters believe that several of the criticisms the game gets today are unwarranted. However, one of these criticisms stands above the rest of me as particularly incorrect. My hot take for Super Metroid is that the controls hold up really well and that the criticisms against it are extremely exaggerated. I will agree to a couple of small critiques first. I think swapping through the HUD can be slow, especially when going to the grapple beam or the X-ray scope, and it is odd that most buttons can be repurposed for any action, but L and R have to be used for angling the arm cannon for some reason. I'll also say that losing the screw attack during the wall jump animation can be very annoying. The arguments about the wall jumping itself are strange though, as many say it's too hard to learn the timing, but I'd argue that the timing on the wall jump makes learning and mastering the move much more satisfying, and getting better at the technique over time only adds to the replayability, as you break the game more and more with each subsequent playthrough. The timing is also well telegraphed by Samus's wall clinging animation, so it's really just down to the willingness of the player to learn it. Another ability that has to be learned is the space jump, and it too gets way too much unnecessary shade. The main argument against it is that you can't respin if you get hit or after shooting like you can in the later games. While I agree that respinning is a nice quality of life update, not having it barely ever hurts anyway, as most instances don't come close to requiring respinning. It also makes getting the screw attack way more satisfying, as now the space jump can no longer be interrupted by enemy attacks. Many complain about the timing of the jump as well, but I can't say I've ever had a big problem with it. The window for space jumping is fairly generous while also not being spammable, which would just make using the ability mind-numbing. It actually engages with the player, making them actually learn how to use it. Also, I played Return of Samus. Nothing Super Space Jump throws my way holds a candle to that monster. To me, the controls hold up very well even to this day, especially since the buttons are all huddled together, making performing 2 or even 3 actions at once, such as jumping and shooting at the same time, comfortable and easy. And then throwing and angling your shots while doing this is effortless too. All of it just flows very smoothly in my hands. The grapple beam and Samus's floatiness are also criticized, but that's more of a physics issue, and that is a whole nother story. But in short, Super's controls are not as good as Dread's, to be sure, but come on, saying they've aged terribly is just not true. Fusion is one of the more controversial games in the series, splitting fans due to its linear gameplay and story-heavy nature. But one thing all fans can agree on is that the SAX is a fantastic villain. The design, atmosphere, and thematic elements around it make it one of the best antagonists in the franchise. However, I have one complaint about the SAX that no one else seems to have. One thing I think this otherwise top-tier villain misses the mark on. My hot take for Fusion is that the SAX isn't scary. The game does a lot to set up the SAX as a frightful antagonist, and it does that wonderfully, but only until you actually encounter the creature in gameplay. I'm not going to bore you by saying it fails to spark fear in subsequent playthroughs. Everybody knows by now that the SAX encounters are scripted and easy to predict after playing the game once or twice. I'm talking about the first playthrough. All it does is just walk slowly and leave the room. And even that only happens a few times. You just watch as it walks away and then continue like nothing happened not 30 seconds later. And it's because of that that most SAX encounters are just sort of forgettable. I will say, the encounter you have with it later in the game in Sector 2 is excellent. The game dangles you from the edge. You have to drop down to the source of those foreboding footsteps, and you have to run away while opening doors and breaking walls. Now that's truly terrifying stuff. The other encounters just drop the ball though. Of course, the last 2 times you see the SAX are when it dies in Sector 6 and when you fight another one at the end of the game. And obviously it's going to lose its horror sting. I mean, at the end of the game when you can fight back against it, and of course in Sector 6 when it just dies, there's nothing to be scared of. Overall, I still think the SAX is an S-tier villain in the franchise, with the thematic elements, atmosphere, and design being great. But to say the SAX is genuinely scary is an exaggeration. Though the game was remade with the SAX to acting like the Emmys in Dread, I don't think this hot take would stay above ground much longer. Metroid Prime is considered to be among the greatest games of all time. And for good reason. The haunting, isolating atmosphere, the sublime yet subtle storytelling, the well-built sound mechanics, and the way those mechanics flawlessly translate to combat, the intricate and expansive puzzles, the sheer, awe-inspiring scale and spectacle, the optional yet fleshed-out world-building, the rich, seemingly endless lore, and the progression system of power-ups are all perfectly done. And the soundtrack? Great moons of Zebus. This game is a gorgeous soundtrack. The level design is mostly up there with the other reasons for why this game is so spectacular. But this aspect of the game is definitely hindered quite a bit. My hot take is in regards to one area in particular. Magmore Caverns is trash. There's nothing to do there. It's just a giant hub world for the other areas in the game, making traversing it a bore. The soundtrack in Magmore is the saving grace, of course, but the area has no complex or interconnected pathways like the others do, so it's just an uninteresting straight line, and you hardly ever even get to hear the whole score anyway. Some individual rooms are nice, like the puzzle room for the plasma beam, that's really cool, but most are just long linear rooms riddled with Magmore's puffers or flying pirates, and seeing them for the 187th time, they get very obnoxious. Even the aesthetic is just boring to look at. It's nothing but rocks and lava for days without anything to spice it up. Overall, Magmore Caverns is a snooze fest of a sector with very few redeeming qualities. Metroid Prime is a wonderfully crafted game, but Magmore Caverns just it ain't part of the team, man. Zero Mission is a stellar remake of the original Metroid, bringing the touted classic up to speed with the modern age, making some much needed changes to the game. Among these touch-ups is a slight overhaul to the story in terms of items, areas, and abilities. These changes, though great in a vacuum, come attached with several story problems, to the point that it's barely even a hot take and more so just a calling out when I tell you, this game causes a lot of issues by way of creating inconsistencies and plot holes. The one that always irked me the most is the items added once you beat the Chozo Ruins test in Chozodia. For beating the boss, you're gifted the Space Jump, Plasma Beam, and the Gravity Suit, all of which are completely incongruent with the beginning of Prime 1. You know what upgrade you don't get though? The Grapple Beam, an item that is present in Prime's prologue. Story-wise, Samus in the beginning of Prime 1 is supposed to come with upgrades like the Varia Suit and the Morph Ball to keep continuity with the first game, you know, before she of course loses her powers for the 388th time. The only of these upgrades that Zero Mission justifies is the Charge Beam, as that wasn't in Nestroid, but was added to the remake. After that, the Grapple Beam goes unexplained, leaving players to guess why she has it, and Zero Mission has them taking complete stabs in the dark as to how she somehow lost the most useful and powerful abilities in her arsenal. This is without even mentioning the other abilities she somehow loses between Zero Mission and Prime. Like, really think about it. Where did the super missiles and power bombs go? There's actually another big plot hole relating to the beginning of Prime 1, which was created by Zero Mission. When the space pirates shoot down her ship near the end of Zero Mission, her ship crash lands onto the surface of Zebes. Despite her not having her power suit, and despite the fact that Zebes has over 1,065 times Earth's gravity, which I discussed in my last broadcast, she survives without a scratch. However, in Prime 1, she loses the legendary Varia suit due to a much smaller, much less devastating explosion. These two instances clash heavily with each other over how tough Samus really is. And while some would say that Prime is just as inconsistent as Zero Mission, since they're the two sides of both of these inconsistencies, I'm pinning the blame on Zero Mission, as it came out after Prime 1 and should have accounted for these events. The game also has inconsistencies with other Metroid works. Of course, Volume 2 of the prequel manga ends much differently than Zero Mission, with Zero Mission not having Grey Voice appear, whose ghost helps Samus to the Varia suit in the manga. Speaking of the Varia suit, that happens to be the upgrade she finds being guarded by Kraid in the manga, which Zero Mission contradicts by having Kraid guard the speed booster instead. Zero Mission clashes with Super Metroid as well, giving Samus the ability to wall jump and shine spark all the way at the beginning of the timeline, despite her learning those moves from the animals in Super, which is clearly stated as being the case in Fusion. It also clashes with Other M, as that game claims that Mother Brain possesses telepathy and has control over the Metroids. According to Zero Mission though, this clearly isn't true, as the Metroids are running rampant and killing all the Zebesians in Turian. Other M should take the blame for this one, as it came out well after Zero Mission, but considering Zero Mission's track record staying in line with the series' storyline, any mark against it by this point is gonna look pretty bad. I can't think of any more inconsistencies at this time, but from the numerous plot holes that I've shown to you, the deck is clearly stacked against Zero Mission, in terms of staying congruent with the established timeline and canon. The beam ammo system rocks. That's it. That's my hot take. It boggles my mind how many people consider the ammo system for the beam upgrades to be among Echo's greatest sins. And I am absolutely sick of it. The light and dark beams are wicked powerful for early game items, and the Annihilator beam is just straight up broken. And I love the fact that the beams are as powerful as they are, which makes limiting the use of them absolutely necessary. Every time I switch off the power beam, I feel like I'm about to absolutely wreak havoc on my opponents. And it wouldn't feel like that if they were unlimited weapons. It feels that way because I'm gonna destroy them in a few shots. And it's only because of the limited ammo that the beams can be that strong. It's also just so unique for Metroid, as the idea hasn't been done before or since, and I think it helps Echo stand out from the crowd. The people who hate this system generally argue that ammo runs out too quickly, and I just don't understand the complaint. Refills are abundantly generous, with hordes of swarm enemies and destructible plants being present just about everywhere in the game to refill. The amount of ammo is especially enough after getting a couple of ammo expansion upgrades, which for me were a joy to find being so unique and much rarer and more rewarding than missiles in terms of collectibles. It also actually makes you think about whether it's worth using it or not sometimes, and I really enjoy having to consider which form of combat suits the situation best. It adds a layer of complexity unique to Echoes. Also, the people who say that the limited ammo can cause soft locks especially are just objectively wrong. You can still open doors without ammo, you just need to fire a charge shot. The ammo system as a whole is great. It makes you feel powerful, while also enriching the combat, which is one of the less stellar aspects of Prime 1. But I suppose some people prefer the more primitive combat of the first Prime game. Prime Pinball, in most aspects, cannot stand up to the quality of the other games. That said, there is one area of the game that shines just as brightly as the others. My hot take for Prime Pinball is that it low-key has one of the best soundtracks in the series. Granted, they are just remixes, but there's something about them. They have this arcadey spin to them that makes them sound so unique. And they make the audio crunch on the DS somehow sound like a part of the music instead of an obnoxious hindrance. It also lifts some of the best soundtracks from the Prime games and uses them in just the right spots, quietly making its OST one of the best in the franchise. I mean, it's not even just better than like the spin-offs or Other M. Pinball legitimately has a better soundtrack than major titles like Fusion, Dread, Return of Samus, Nestroid. Heck, I'd even argue it's up there with the likes of Zero Mission and Prime 3. Of course, it's not top tier like Super Prime or Echoes, and I'd also say Samus Returns is comfortably above it, but after that, it is an open competition for pinball music-wise. I genuinely believe that the only reason more people don't think this is the case is because it's a pinball game, and the vast majority of Metroid fans have never played it. Because otherwise, I can only imagine that this game would rightfully be recognized for being among the best games in the series, in terms of music. Metroid Prime Hunters is generally regarded warmly by fans for its unique hunter characters, with many also citing its memorable multiplayer mode as their favorite part of the game. I am not one of them, as I've only ever played the single player mode. Despite that, I believe I've played more than enough of the game to say this. My hot take is that Metroid Prime Hunters is the worst spin-off game of the series. Between Pinball, Hunters, and Federation Force, Hunters is simply the least well made. In the campaign mode alone, the AI on the Hunters is annoying and spammy, the story is very cookie cutter at best, feeling like a knockoff of Prime 1's story without the nuance or the world building. bosses are the same thing over and over again. There's just very little to do other than running straight through a level and beating another hunter as a result of the minimalistic, multiplayer-focused level design, and that's all without mentioning the horrendous graphics and the especially terrible controls, which plague the whole game and make it much harder to engage with. The game also doesn't feature many memorable tracks. The only one that comes to mind as a genuinely good score here is Silence's theme, and even that isn't on the level of something like, Rundus's theme or Vendrana Drifts. Prime Pinball has a much better soundtrack and better gameplay due to the simplistic nature of pinball and its controls, and Federation Force, while also having a very bland and contrived story, is much nicer to look at, along with having serviceable controls and better progression with the mods, and notably better world building as well, as it shows a lot of what the Federation has been cooking in an age where Samus has been doing most of the heavy lifting. The only reasons I can think of for why fans generally view this as the best spin-off is because of the hunters, the multiplayer mode, and because the game is the most Metroid of the group, playing like a traditional Metroid Prime game unlike Pinball, and with Samus at the helm unlike Federation Force. However, I'll have to disagree, as even though I haven't played the multiplayer yet, I can't possibly imagine it being good enough to single-handedly save this game for the title of worst spin-off. Being made for the Wii, Retro Nintendo Studios decided to give Metroid Prime 3 a one-year delay so that the controls could be reworked for the Wii remote. As a result, it was the first Metroid game with motion controls added to it. Despite the delay for fine-tuning, these controls are very controversial, as many complained then, and continue to do so now, that the motion controls are poorly made and tedious to use, incentivizing cheap gimmicks over the status quo of quality Metroid gameplay. I am not in that camp. My hot take for Metroid Prime 3 is that the motion controls and the ways they're implemented actually enhance the game to a significant degree, as opposed to hurting it. I'll get the obvious out of the way and mention quickly that the aiming is simply sublime. The one-for-one movement with the pointer controls feels flawlessly connected to Samus's arm cannon, and that connection brings a whole new level of immersion into what were already some of the most immersive games on the market. That immersion carries over to most of the other motion control movements as well, with the grapple beam being the biggest benefactor of the new control scheme, what with swinging it around to grapple from place to place and ripping enemy shields right from their hands. By and large, I had an absolute blast with the motion controls, and they worked perfectly most of the time, paving the path for what was the true Metroid Prime experience, until the remaster came out with dual-stick controls plus gyro aiming and ruined all that. There are occasional moments where the controls don't work so well, especially when a motion requires the Wii Remote's Achilles heel, twisting and turning, but many act like these minor issues are somehow horrendous deal-breaking alterations to a previously amazing control scheme. For the people complaining about Metroid Prime 3 being a gimmick game for its motion controls, I have to ask, have you played shovelware on the Wii? As a Family Game Night 2 survivor, I can tell you quite comfortably that Corruption doesn't sniff the status of a gimmicky motion control game. But just to be sure, I think it'd be disingenuous to say Prime 3's motion controls are only good because the other games use the Wii Remote worse, because that would insinuate that Corruption's controls are just serviceable. Make no mistake, the controls in Metroid Prime 3 are an absolute blast that turn Corruption into an immersive spectacle and only add to the already extremely high quality of the Prime sub-series. I won't beat around the bush in saying that I absolutely despise this game, so you won't be hearing me defending Other M here. Hating Other M isn't quite a hot take though, except for a very specific argument I've heard defending the game way too many times. Of the Other M defenders, many claim that the myriad of problems with the story are exclusive to the Western release of the game, and the story told in the Japanese version is actually quite good. After seeing what the Japanese version was like, I've concluded that this is a bunch of nonsense. My hot take for Other M is that the Japanese version of the story in no way salvages this dumpster fire of a game, and even in and of itself, is nothing noteworthy. Essentially, all the Japanese version does differently is make Samus view Adam as more of a mentor than a father figure, which, to be fair, is a welcome change, and it gives the story more of a theme about maturing and growing beyond youthful rashness. In particular, conquering trauma and learning that you can't save everyone. That would be fine in a vacuum, but why are we having a story like this here? Samus has destroyed multiple planets and genocided multiple species by this point. There's no reason to even suggest that she hasn't matured by this point. As far as not saving everybody goes, Samus already couldn't save Grey Voice, the Chozo on Talon 4, the Brionians, the Elysians, Rundus, Gandrada, Gore, 37% of Admiral Dane's fleet, or a significant chunk of Alex Miles' fleet. And that's if you omit the baby Metroid and her biological parents. Which I would, because she was 3 when her parents died, and the baby Metroid is more of a sacrifice than Samus being unable to save it. So I think she should know that by now. And on Samus' trauma, she's conquered that all the way back in the prequel manga, all the way at the beginning of the series. And yet, she still has that PTSD attack when facing Ridley, which doesn't make sense regardless of which version you're talking about. Of course, that just leads to all the other stupid story elements that are also still in the game, like Samus waiting for permission to use her upgrades, anything to do with Mother Brain, especially the telepathy bit, Adam somehow disarming Samus with 1 Ice Beam shot, anything to do with Adam's sacrifice, the deleter arc just being forgotten by the writers halfway through the game, the creatures thrown in for fanservice that have no business being there like Fantoon, and just the bland and unlikable cast of characters, aside from Anthony, who somehow survived this shipwreck of a game unscathed. All of the issues I just mentioned are story problems, which completely ignores the gameplay and its many sins. You still have to play without a nunchuck, you still have those god-awful point-and-click adventure bits, you still have to switch perspectives to use the missiles, Samus randomly decides to activate power bombs and you're just supposed to know that you die to the Metroid Queen, multiple enemies one-shot you, there's those terrible Resident Evil 4-esque over-the-shoulder moments that are just so slow, and doors still randomly lock behind you, among more atrocities that I'd not like to list. There's even more issues outside of the gameplay and the story, like the gravity feature, which is the worst suit in all of Metroid, and the numerous contradictions it has with basically every Metroid game, the list of which is too long to do justice here. So I have to ask all of the people using the Japanese version of the game to defend Other M. You call all of that a translation error? Poor Federation Force. You could have gotten the love you deserve, but you were released at the worst possible time. I mentioned earlier that Prime Hunters is my least favorite spin-off game, and I think that makes what I'm about to say not all too shocking, but it's certainly not a sentiment shared by many. My hot take for Metroid Prime Federation Force is that it is the most underrated game in the entire franchise. The only game in the series that comes close to taking the crown from it is Return of Samus, but even that game has its fans, whilst nobody acknowledges this game for the fun that it is. It's certainly not on the level of the Prime trilogy, don't get me wrong, but the gameplay, mechanics, and controls do feel lifted from those games, and from that feel sound and depthful. The mods aren't anything crazy either, but they do add a welcome layer of decision making to the game, allowing you to pick and choose which upgrades you'll have to forego and which ones suit your preferred playstyle. That's all speaking about gameplay though, and it'd be nothing less than a slight against this game to not mention what it does for Metroid's world building. Things like Samus sharing her inventions with the Federation, to seeing what happened to the Space Pirates after their defeat in Prime 3, to seeing what the Federation does when they aren't just sending in Samus and hoping for the best. Among other additions, Federation Force really fleshes out the world of Metroid. The story is nothing crazy, but other than the stupid soccer ball Samus boss fight and honestly the ending in general, it has its saving graces as well. Like how the Federation Commander Alex Miles asks you to steal a Metroid egg, which is possibly showing that he, and by proxy, other high-ranking members of the galactic government, are working with corrupt factions of the Federation, like the one seen in Fusion and Other M. And there's the part where Sylix steals the same Metroid hatchling, which could be setting up the events of Metroid Prime 4. Overall, while it's not some masterpiece, there's a good deal of fun to be had here. With a serviceable story to back it, and excellent world building for the franchise's standards, Federation Force stands out to me as the underrated gem of the series, and I think it's a shame it released when it did, because if it had come out after Samus Returns, then I don't think it'd be overlooked the way it is. Speaking of Samus Returns, being a long-awaited remake of Return of Samus, this game was one that was highly anticipated amongst the core Metroid community. But having released just 1 year after Nintendo powerbombed AM2R out of existence, it also faced heavy controversy in the community. One of the biggest of these points of contention is the controversial changes to the ending. Those who have played Return of Samus generally agree that the ending is among the best and most memorable parts of the game. It's a quiet and introspective trek back to Samus's gunship, a sharp change of pace right at the end of the game that makes the player question whether exterminating the Metroids was truly the right decision as you watch the baby bond with Samus and help her get back to her gunship. Samus Returns, in stark contrast, has an ending littered with the same enemies you've seen all game, a definitely not conspicuous pair of recharge stations, and culminates in a bombastic boss fight with the all-new Proteus Ridley shrouded in the ever-foreboding skies of SR388. I can tell you that I am not a fan of the ending myself, and I agree with many of the criticisms the new ending gets. It butchered a lot of what the original ending managed to accomplish 26 years prior. That said, there's one change I don't believe deserves the criticisms it gets, and was overall a great addition to the end of the game. My hot take for Samus Returns is that the ending of the game benefits significantly from the addition of Proteus Ridley, and his appearance almost saves the otherwise atrocious ending. The positives of his inclusion are generally agreed upon, as most can agree that in terms of gameplay, this is one of the best battles against Ridley in the series. The design of Ridley also seems to be mostly appreciated, as many were happy to see a mainline game arguably tie the mainline series together with the Prime series. After that though, the criticisms begin, and lackluster ones at that. The complaint I've seen the most is that considering Ridley steals the baby Metroid in Super, and seeing as these two games are so close together chronologically, it doesn't make sense that he'd be bested by Samus on SR388, only to beat her there. I think this is an odd criticism, as if anything, this makes Ridley stealing the baby Metroid make more sense. I mean, really think about it. How did Ridley know that Samus was heading to Sarah Station in the first place? It only makes sense that he'd know because he followed Samus there, and him being on SR388 makes him simply following Samus to Ceres far more likely. Now some of you might be thinking that he was in no shape to chase after Samus after just getting whooped. And while a fair counterpoint at face value, a keen rewatching of the ending shows that this is not the case. Seeing the post-credit scene again, we see that the X-Parasite begin taking over the planet mere moments after Samus leaves, starting at the landing site, which is the exact same place where Samus and Ridley fought. Seeing as that's the case, it becomes clear that Ridley had to have left the planet no more than a few minutes after he lost the fight. And considering how little time it took for him to get back on his feet, he'd definitely be able to chase Samus down to start the events of Super Metroid. People also complain that his presence botches the ending of Return of Samus. And again, I agree that the ending of Samus Returns is a travesty, but Ridley's presence in a vacuum is great in gameplay and in lore. And the only reason his presence wasn't good for the story isn't because of him. It's the repeating enemies and recharge stations that are the real problem. Imagine this scenario in your head. You kill the Queen Metroid after an arduous battle against her. Much like the original game, your health and ammo arbitrarily replenish themselves. You think nothing of it, and you get to that poignant moment where Samus chooses to spare the baby. The two help each other along the way back, bonding on a quiet journey to Samus's gunship. After about 5 minutes of peacefully making your way through the lifeless labyrinth, you see your ship at the end of the game below. You get ready to hop down at the end of the game, all but putting your 3DS away already. And it's in that moment, when your guard is completely down, it's then that Ridley strikes, snatching the infant away from you. Ridley himself could have totally worked with the ending of the original Metroid 2. It's just the rest of the game's changes that couldn't. I just think it's a real shame that the awesome addition of Ridley gets tossed aside with all the other junk as being nothing more than a pointless addition that harms the once great ending, because in my eyes, his inclusion in the game was great for gameplay, lore, and had the rest of the ending been done right, it could have been great for Metroid 2's storytelling as well. Dread is the most recent original and highest selling game in the franchise to date, so naturally, many eyes have been on this game since its reveal in June 2021. The game has garnered near universal acclaim, being lauded for its gameplay, stories, controls, level design, yada yada yada. You get the idea. However, there is one common complaint about Dread, which would be the music, with many being quick to call out the distinct lack of memorable scores in the game. While I don't exactly think the soundtrack is on par with Metroid music at its best, I also think these complaints are overblown. My hot take for Metroid Dread is that the music is not nearly as bad as people say it is. Of course, the remixes are great as always, but everyone knows that. What new tracks does Dread bring to the table? While there aren't many, a couple of tracks stand out to me. For one, Furenia has a very good score attached to it. It kinda reminds me of Brio's main theme, which I'm a big fan of. It's atmospheric, but it's not necessarily dark and melodic. Instead, it's sharp and tense, with a fluctuating pace, which eggs the player on to keep moving and make it out alive, while also helping to push the feeling of grandeur the area is going for, with its massive Chozo statues and golden sun-dipped aesthetic. I'm also partial to Ravenbeak's theme, as the choirs really nail the presence of him being the first living Chozo in the series, let alone him being the final battle. Choirs have long been a part of Metroid's music, but the way it's used here, it's like a tribute almost, like the fallen Machina hailing their leader as he attempts to maim you. It's also just solid boss music, a mix of powerful and pumping, saying, this is a powerful opponent, but you're ready to fight it. Much like the theme of Emperor Ing from Echoes, though I have to mention that the Monarch of Darkness does take the crown in terms of music. The staff credits theme is also quite nice, as while it's not top tier, the blend of reminiscent quiet parts and loud bombastic moments feel like an appropriately triumphant mix, fitting for the end of a saga 35 years in the making. I can't say that there are any other tracks that are particularly great, as overall, I do agree that Dread is definitely one of the weaker titles in terms of music. But these three tracks, combined with the aforementioned remixes, and some other solid tracks strewn about, all help to make Dread's OST a lot better than people are willing to give it credit for. Being the newest game in the series, Prime Remastered has earned this franchise new fans while giving the old ones a fresh catch of nostalgia, headlined by the complete overhaul in visuals. Many have clamored about the game as being one of the best looking games on the Switch, and rightfully so, but I'm going higher. My hot take is that Metroid Prime Remastered is the best looking game on the Nintendo Switch. The visual fidelity alone is stunning for a Switch game. Like, playing it for the first time genuinely had me questioning why my Switch was not actively exploding while playing it. The graphical fidelity is legitimately better than PS4 titles like Doom 2016, which shouldn't even be close to possible considering, again, this is the Switch we're talking about. That alone propels it to be among the best looking Switch games, but once you add on the artistic direction of Prime, please, it's not even a competition. The art direction for the game could not have possibly encompassed the style of Metroid better, as it's absolutely stunning to see how flawlessly the game translates the style. I cannot stress it enough. They nailed the Metroid mix between realistic and cartoonish, and that mix helps it look even greater and gives it a unique vibe. The game is absolutely gorgeous, and I can't call Retro anything less than tech wizards for getting a game that looks this great to run on the Switch. So what do you think about my Metroid hot takes? Do you find yourself agreeing with my bold opinions regarding these games? Do you think I've got vapor for brains for thinking any of these could possibly be true? Do you find yourself somewhere in between? If any of these opinions stood out to you in particular, if you have your own hot takes you're just dying to tell everyone, or if you just have general thoughts you'd like to share with me, please leave them in the digital reply box down below, as station feedback is always appreciated. That will be all for today's transmission. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember that my opinions are definitely always correct, and I'll see you next broadcast.